If you went back to the beginning of 2024 and told me that my favorite film of that year would be a film shot almost entirely from the first-person perspective, I would have probably rolled my eyes. At first glance, it seems sorta gimmicky. Typically, when films opt for this stylistic choice, it's only for a scene or two, and is rarely employed for the entire runtime. So why do filmmakers choose to avoid this approach? And how does this film, Nickel Boys, manage to pull it off? As the audience, we have a preconceived idea of how cinematic form tends to operate, at least in some intuitive sense.
You tell them a messiah will come, then they'll wait for centuries.
When a cut happens, it indicates the place where our attention should be drawn. When one shot of something is shown to the audience that is then followed by one of a character glancing in the adjacent eyeline, there is an implied context and significance between the two images. The implication changes depending on what is shown before the character. This is known as the Kulashov Effect, coined by Lev Kulashov, a filmmaker who demonstrated this through a series of interchanged images that came after a neutral shot of a man's face. It has remained an essential component of the language of cinema for most of its history, allowing filmmakers to dictate pace, emotional implication, and contextual manipulation through the edit. Most importantly, it helps to shape an actor's performance in any given scene. It's no wonder filmmakers don't want to eliminate this technique from their arsenal. If an entire film plays out through the literal eyes of a protagonist, then we never get to see their face. So we don't have access to the nuances of an actor's performance. Let's look at how they get around this in Nickel Boys. RaMell Ross, the director, solves this problem by alternating the first-person POV between two protagonists. At around the end of the first act, after having spent all of our time seeing the world through Elwood's perspective, Turner's point of view is added to the film. Now we are allowed to see Elwood through the eyes of someone else. In this scene, Ross frees up the camera's restraints by intercutting between the two perspectives.
Turner, that's a $100 bill. He's putting a hurt on that white boy.
Elwood spots an exchange being made across the room. We then cut to Turner's POV to see Elwood's reaction. The Kulashov effect stays intact. When we're not cutting between the two perspectives, there are still character-defining signals to the audience through the way the camera tilts up or down, telling us where Elwood is choosing to direct his gaze or when he feels the need to avert it. Ross and cinematographer Jomo Fray also don't stick to one focal length, which at first might seem confusing when a cut to a longer lens from an established wide happens. This is done to replicate the way our eyes focus on specific elements in whatever space we're inhabiting. A camera doesn't see the same way that we do, so to communicate where our attention should be in a scene, Nickel Boys chooses to occasionally crop in. The visual grammar of the film does take a moment to make sense of. In revisiting it though, you'll find that it's essentially seamless. But all technicalities aside, why is Nickel Boys shot in the first person to begin with? I think to answer that question, we first have to establish an understanding of the content. It's important to note that although the film includes race as a thematic component, it is not really the primary focus of the film. Ross himself has stated that Nickel Boys is not a film about race. The intention in this instance was to avoid simply reducing these characters to their trauma. Not only is Ross adapting an already established book, but he is also depicting a story that stems from real events from the not-so-distant past. Dabbling in such subject matter can result in gratuitous or potentially banal depictions of the Black American identity. There is a deliberate omission of any explicit reenactment of violence inflicted on the boys at this reform school. Ross's approach is agnostic, and anything beyond the scope of certainty is implied. Really, Nickel Boys is first and foremost a film about perspective and the process of looking. Ross and Fray call their approach sentient filmmaking. In most films, the camera is an omniscient observer, but with Nickel Boys, it becomes a participant in the story. It is made clear to the audience that the movement of the camera is directly tied to the eyes of the subject. In a way, this mitigates the objectifying simplification of seeing the characters as just the subject of the film.
How interesting is it that historical characters and historical figures are only and can only be explored from the outside of themselves? Like their reality, their subjectivity, the sensory nature of what it is to be a human in the world is the most universal thing we have in common. And so to kind of bring the camera into the body and to make it an organ, I like to say, for those characters, seems to be maybe the fairest way of exploring their reality in that we're not thinking about them as others. We're thinking of them as having the same agency that we have now and allowing them to make decisions from inside their context, not us watching them from our context in their context.
When the audience shares the gaze of the protagonists, they share the role of observer. Take this scene, for instance, which concludes the opening sequence before we transition to teenage Elwood. There is just something slightly more compelling about seeing this moment of realization through his eyes, rather than watching him make the realization. The camera is skipping past a subtle barrier. Instead of only seeing how a character occupies space, we see how they interpret it. Ross is more so in conversation with the work of Terrence Malick or Andrei Tarkovsky than he is with traditional narrative filmmaking. Just watch his 2018 documentary Hale County this evening. He is sensory focused and interested in poetic communication with the viewer. We see Elwood's fascination with the mundane beauty of the world around him. The blades of grass, a dangling fruit, a family member's bracelet. We learn the nuances of his character through the way he twirls a thread around his finger or fidgets with a dead leaf. The audience's engagement is vicarious, so the emphasis is now on the elements in a scene that the protagonist fixates on. The effect that this has is a mutual understanding of our shared existence and beingness, which evokes much more visceral emotions by the end of the film, despite not engaging in any gratuitous violence. In the final moments, we lose Elwood, someone we've come to understand in a much more granular and intuitive way, instead of simply losing him as a character who was contextually important to the plot. At this point in the film, it is also revealed that the older Elwood we've occasionally cut to is actually Turner taking on Elwood's identity. Another bold stylistic decision is made in these time-jumping scenes, where Ross and Fray film older Turner from behind using a snorri cam, where the rig is attached to the actor. It might seem out of place, but I think Ross gives quite a compelling reason for this choice.
What happens when a person takes on another person's identity? What happens when their earth is shattered? What happens when they're forced to kind of see themselves going through the world? They're almost disembodied. Like, what a beautiful idea. The second that adult Elwood has to become the adult Elwood from this deep, tragic thing that happens when they're on the run, if he's separated from himself. And then, obviously, over the course of the end of the film, he returns to himself through the love of his partner.
When Elwood is murdered, Turner's identity is forever tied to that moment, and the camera reflects that. The self is now disjointed, and so is the camera. Just one more example of Nickel Boy's maintaining sound motivation behind its subversion of form. Of course, this can all be achieved without the use of first-person or sentient photography or snorri cam, but that doesn't mean these choices are unjust. In fact, I think the cinematography more than justifies itself. Ross embeds these choices into the foundation of the themes. The process of looking entails an exploration into scale. The camera has a neutrality. Being at the constant eye level with the protagonists allows for a more poignant juxtaposition with the film's allegorical imagery. Ross is posing questions about our relationship with the vast and volatile world that we exist in. What is the significance of Elwood and Turner's story in the grand scope of space exploration? Why have they been overlooked on humanity's list of priorities? And where does an alligator, or a horse, or a reptile smaller than the palm of your hand fit into this narrative? The innate solipsistic barrier between a spectator of historical events and the people who lived in that time is a barrier that Ross is attempting to break down, or at least poke holes in. Nickel Boys tries to have us view the world through these characters instead of seeing them outside of ourselves. When we are shown that someone can have the same sensory experience and intuitive fascination with perceiving, we experience a different type of empathy. Look, I don't think that every film from now on should be shot like this one. In fact, I would probably advocate against that, but that is what makes Nickel Boys so remarkable. They managed to sincerely employ the point-of-view cinematography in a way that cohesively complements the story. And if a filmmaker can do that, then yeah, why not? So you made it to the end of the video. You might as well leave a like, and you might as well subscribe. Turn on notifications if you're feeling bold. It's been a while since I've uploaded, but I want to continue putting out videos just like this one, so if you enjoyed, it'd be great if you stuck around. Feel free to sound off in the comments, as this film has plenty more to offer than just my one interpretation. But yeah, thanks for watching.